Clara had never been one to overreact, but on that stormy night everything felt different. The winds were howling outside, the kind of storm that makes everything in the house tremble. The wooden beams creaked, and the windows rattled as if the entire world outside was shifting. But it wasn't the storm that had woken her, it was the sounds coming from the stable. At first she thought it was the wind playing tricks on her, but then she heard it again. A strange, almost unnatural noise, like the sound of something moving, something in distress. She tossed her blanket aside and jumped to her feet, her heart already pounding. What could it be? Maybe one of the horses was injured. But the more she thought about it, the more uneasy she felt. There was something about the noise that felt wrong. Terrifying even. Clara quickly pulled on her boots and grabbed a thick coat hanging by the door. Her hands were trembling as she reached for the lantern, and for a moment she hesitated. Was it really worth investigating? Shouldn't she just wait it out? But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. With no time to waste, she rushed outside into the storm, her mind racing with worries she couldn't yet put into words. The storm was fierce, but Clara pushed forward, trying to focus on the path ahead. She made her way to the stable, the wind whipping against her face, the sound of the rain deafening. The barn was only a short distance away, but it felt like an eternity. Every time the wind howled, it drowned out all other sounds, leaving Clara with a gnawing sense of dread. She couldn't explain why, but something about the situation felt unnatural. By the time she reached the stable, her heart was racing. She could barely see through the heavy rain, but she could hear the frantic movements inside. With shaky hands, she opened the stable door, bracing herself for what lay beyond it. The light from the lantern flickered as she stepped inside, and it took her a moment to adjust her eyes to the dim light. What she saw next would haunt her for the rest of her life. Estrella, the mare, was lying on the floor, her body trembling, and there, beneath her, someone, was moving. Clara's breath caught in her throat. At first she thought it was a mistake. Perhaps she was still half dreaming, still trapped in the fog of sleep. But no, what she was seeing was real. Estrella, her beloved horse, was giving birth, but instead of a foal, there was a human baby. Clara's knees nearly buckled beneath her as she watched the tiny creature emerge from Estrella's body, still covered in a slimy, viscous membrane, gasping for air. She had no words, no understanding. The baby let out a weak cry, and in that moment Clara's world shifted. Her first instinct was to rush to the child, to help it, to protect it, but her mind was in chaos. What was happening? How was this even possible? Her hand shook as she kneeled beside the baby, torn between fear and an overwhelming urge to care for it. She couldn't leave it here, not like this, but how would she explain it? How could anyone believe what she was seeing? She looked at Estrella, her horse, who was now lying exhausted on the ground, the weight of the situation settling in. What had just happened? What had she witnessed? Clara gently lifted the baby from the straw, cradling it in her arms as if it were the most fragile thing she had ever held. The baby's skin was slick, its small chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. It was alive, a tiny human being, but the shock of it all was almost too much for her to bear. She glanced down at Estrella, who lay motionless on the ground, her eyes half-lidded, exhausted from the ordeal. Clara knew she had to act quickly. The mare needed help, but the baby, this baby, was her priority now. Clara had no idea what to do. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't trained to handle emergencies like this, and yet somehow the instinct to protect kicked in. She wrapped the baby in a clean cloth she had lying in the stable and began to softly hum, trying to soothe it. The cry had stopped, but she could still feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. What was happening here? How could this be real? It didn't make sense. Her mind raced for an explanation, but every possibility she considered only made her feel more lost. And then a sound. Footsteps. Footsteps outside the stable. Clara froze, the baby still in her arms, her heart skipping a beat. The last thing she needed right now was for someone to walk in and see this. What would they think? What would they say? The town was already known for its superstitions, and the last thing she wanted was for them to believe she had done something to cause this. She rushed to the door, trying to shield the baby from view. But it was too late. Pedro, one of the farmhands, had already stepped inside, his eyes widening at the sight of the mare and Clara with the baby. Pedro's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. "What is this? Clara, what is going on here?" he asked, his voice trembling. Clara didn't know how to answer. She couldn't explain what had happened because deep down she didn't understand it herself. She could see the fear in Pedro's eyes, and she knew that fear would only spread if the others found out. "You need to help me," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Please, I need to keep this baby safe." Pedro stared at her, clearly confused, his gaze darting between her and the infant in her arms. "But Clara, this is not natural. This is wrong," he said, his voice filled with doubt. Clara's heart sank. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, and she knew that he was already beginning to believe the whispers that had always circulated around the village, the old rumors about witches and curses. He had heard them too, just like everyone else. But Clara wasn't some villain from one of their stories. She was just a young woman, terrified, holding an innocent child that no one seemed to understand. "Pedro, I swear to you, I didn't do anything. This is just happening. Please, help me." But before Pedro could respond, the heavy sound of hooves pounding against the dirt reached Clara's ears. Someone was coming. Someone with authority. Clara's heart sank as she recognized the familiar sound of Don Ramon's horse approaching the stable. He was the landowner of the area, a man feared by all who lived around there. His reputation for cruelty and rigid control was well known. If Don Ramon found out about this, he would not hesitate to take drastic action. Clara had no choice but to act quickly. She turned to Pedro, her eyes wide with panic. "Pedro, please, you have to help me. Keep them away. Keep them away from here, please." Pedro looked at Clara, his face torn between fear and confusion. He wanted to help her, but the weight of the situation was too much. He knew Don Ramon's reputation, and he knew that going against him was a dangerous move. "Clara, I don't know if I can—" he began, but his voice trailed off as the sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Clara didn't wait for him to finish. She had to act fast. Without thinking, she turned on her heel and darted toward the back of the stable, clutching the baby close to her chest. Pedro hesitated for a moment, torn between his loyalty to Clara and the fear that gripped him. But in the end, he did nothing to stop her. He couldn't. Clara stumbled through the dark, trying to navigate her way to the small passage that led out of the stable and toward the backfields. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay here. Not with Don Ramon on his way, not with the whole town about to descend on her, demanding answers she didn't have. The baby's tiny fingers curled around the fabric of her dress, and Clara held it tighter, as though the child could somehow protect her from what was coming. The wind outside had picked up, and the storm that had started hours ago was now raging in full force. She could barely see through the rain as she hurried across the muddy fields, the sound of her feet squelching in the muck beneath her. It felt like the world was closing in around her. How had it come to this? What was happening to her life? Everything she had known seemed to be slipping away in an instant. As Clara reached the edge of the field, she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves behind her, and she turned to see a group of men, led by Don Ramon, approaching. They were coming fast. She couldn't outrun them. Her breath hitched in her throat as panic set in. She wasn't going to make it. She wasn't going to be able to escape with the baby. Her mind raced for any possible solution, but it felt like all her options were closing in on her. The baby stirred in her arms, and Clara's heart tightened. She had to keep it safe. She had to protect it. At that moment, she saw a figure ahead, silhouetted against the stormy sky. It was Juana, her friend from the village, who had always been by her side. Clara's heart leapt. Juana had to help her. She had to. As Clara rushed toward her, the first words out of her mouth were almost a plea. "Juana, they're coming. Don Ramon, he's going to kill it." Juana's eyes widened in shock as Clara approached, but she didn't ask any questions. She knew better than to waste time on that. "Come on," she said, pulling Clara and the baby into her arms. "We have to get out of here, now." The two women ran, with the storm battering their faces and the sound of hooves growing closer. They had no plan, no direction, just the raw, desperate will to survive. It wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was about the baby. It was about keeping it alive no matter what. The chase had begun. The woods were thick with shadows, and Clara's steps faltered as she stumbled through the underbrush. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reminding her that they didn't have much time. The storm had slowed the riders down, but they were relentless. She could hear them yelling in the distance, their voices cutting through the storm like a blade. Clara's body was soaked to the bone, and she could feel the cold seeping into her bones, but it wasn't the cold she feared. It was what came next. What would they do when they found her? What would Don Ramon do to the child? To her? Juana was still with her, pushing ahead through the thick trees, her hand tightly gripping Clara's. "We can't keep running like this, Clara. We need a plan," she said, her voice urgent. Clara shook her head, breathless. What kind of plan could they make when they were being hunted? There was no escape. She could feel it. The fear and the exhaustion were beginning to take their toll. "We'll keep going until we can't anymore," Clara said, her voice strained. "We don't have a choice." The sound of the hooves grew louder. They were getting closer. Clara's eyes darted around, looking for anything they could use, some kind of shelter, anything that could give them a chance. Her gaze landed on a small shack in the distance, abandoned, decaying, but it was something. Clara pushed herself forward, desperate, dragging Juana behind her. The baby whimpered softly, and Clara tightened her grip on it, willing herself not to break down. As they reached the shack, Clara's heart sank. The door was ajar, but it was dark inside, and the air smelled musty. It was hardly a safe haven, but it was better than nothing. The two women hurried inside, closing the door behind them, hoping the storm would mask their presence. They crouched in the corner, trying to catch their breath, their hearts still racing. The wind howled outside, but for the moment, there was silence. Just the sound of the baby's soft cries. "I can't do this, Clara," Juana whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "I can't keep running. What if we're caught?" Clara looked at her, her eyes hard but filled with a sadness that Juana had never seen before. She could feel the weight of everything crashing down on her, but she couldn't let it break her. Not now. Not when the baby's life was at stake. "You don't have a choice, Juana," Clara said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. "None of us do." The storm raged on outside, but Clara's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking of the child she hadn't known existed until that moment, but the child she would die to protect. What kind of mother would she be if she didn't do everything in her power to keep it safe? The thought of Don Ramon finding them made her stomach turn. His hatred, his power, it was enough to destroy them both. But she couldn't let him win. Not when she had finally found the strength to fight back. The hours passed in that cold, decaying shack, the wind outside howling louder with each passing moment. Clara's body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the fear and exhaustion that seemed to weigh down every part of her. Juana had fallen asleep, her head resting against the wall, but Clara couldn't sleep. She couldn't stop thinking about the baby, the tiny life that depended on her now. What would happen to it if they were caught? What would happen to her? The more she thought about it, the more the weight of the situation crushed her, but she refused to give in. Not when there was still a chance, however slim it might be. She lifted the baby in her arms, her hands trembling as she cradled it closer to her chest. She couldn't believe this was happening. A part of her still couldn't comprehend that a child, a human baby, had been born from her own horse. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. But the warmth of the baby's tiny body in her arms, the soft breathing, the little whimpers, these were real. The baby was real, and Clara had no choice but to protect it with everything she had. She closed her eyes, willing herself to calm down to think. A sudden knock on the door broke the silence, and Clara's heart stopped. Her body tensed as her mind raced. Was it them? Was it Don Ramon's men? Her breath caught in her throat as she held the baby tighter, her mind whirling with panic. Another knock, this one more insistent. Clara's instincts told her to stay quiet, not to make a sound, but the knock came again, and then the voice. "Clara, it's me, Carlos." Carlos. The name was familiar, but Clara couldn't place it. She didn't have time to think. Was it a trap? Was it one of Don Ramon's men pretending to be someone else? She felt a surge of panic, but then she heard Juana stir beside her, her voice quiet and questioning. "Clara, do you know a Carlos?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She had to think. Had she met someone named Carlos before? Who could it be? She glanced at Juana, who was now wide awake, her eyes filled with concern. Clara had no idea if she could trust this person, but something in her gut told her it was worth taking the risk. "Carlos?" Clara finally called out, her voice trembling with caution. "Who are you?" The voice on the other side of the door spoke again, this time with more urgency. "It's Carlos, Clara. I'm here to help. You don't have much time. Don Ramon's men are getting closer." Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at Juana. There was no time to waste. If Don Ramon's men were really out there, they had no choice but to trust this Carlos. At least for now. Slowly, she rose to her feet, careful not to disturb the baby, and moved toward the door. Her hand hovered over the handle, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. What if it was a trap? What if Carlos was lying? But she had no other choice. With a deep breath, Clara turned the handle and opened the door just enough to peek out. She was met by the sight of a tall man, his face partially obscured by the shadows, but Clara could see the concern in his eyes. His presence seemed genuine, not threatening. "Clara, let me in," he said softly, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I'm not with Don Ramon. I'm here to help you." Clara hesitated, but she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Once Carlos stepped inside, Clara quickly shut the door behind him, locking it securely. Her heart was still racing, but there was a sense of relief that washed over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was someone who seemed to understand, someone who wasn't out to harm her or the baby. Carlos glanced around the room, his eyes flicking over the small, dimly lit space before he turned his gaze back to Clara. "Don Ramon's men are searching the area. They're not far behind," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move fast if we're going to get you and the baby out of here." Clara nodded, her mind working through the options. She hadn't expected help to come, but now that it had, she couldn't waste it. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Carlos moved closer, kneeling down beside her. "I know a safe place, a cabin in the woods. It's not far, and they'll never find you there." He paused, his eyes scanning her face as if looking for any sign of doubt. "But we need to hurry. Time is running out." Clara's mind raced. The idea of running again, of leaving the only place she had ever known, terrified her. But she had no other choice. She couldn't risk being caught by Don Ramon. Not now. Not when they were so close to freedom. "Okay," Clara said, her voice firm. "Let's go." Carlos grabbed a small bag from the corner of the room, throwing it over his shoulder. "I'll lead the way," he said, turning toward the door. Clara hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the baby in her arms, the tiny life that had been thrust upon her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she couldn't back down now. With one last glance at the room that had been their refuge for so long, Clara followed Carlos into the night. The cold wind bit at her skin, but she didn't feel it. Her thoughts were consumed with the baby, with the danger they were running from. The forest was dark, the trees looming like shadows as they made their way through the underbrush. Clara stumbled over rocks and uneven ground, her legs aching with exhaustion, but she pushed on. The baby was still nestled in her arms, its small body pressed against her chest, warm and fragile. She could hear its soft breathing, and for a moment, it was the only sound in the world that mattered. Carlos led the way, his steps sure and confident, but Clara's mind was constantly on edge. She could almost feel Don Ramon's presence like a shadow following them, always just out of reach. She glanced over her shoulder every few minutes, but there was nothing. No sign of pursuit. Yet the fear never left her. After what felt like hours, they finally arrived at the cabin Carlos had mentioned. It was small, tucked away in the trees, and barely visible from the main trail. Clara breathed a sigh of relief as they stepped inside, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth offering a temporary comfort. But Clara's relief was short-lived. As she set the baby down on the small cot in the corner, her mind raced with the same question that had been haunting her since she first found the child. Why? Why had this happened? Why had her horse given birth to a baby? And what did it all mean? Carlos stood nearby, watching her with concern. "Clara, you're safe for now. You can rest." But Clara couldn't. Not yet. She had to understand. She had to know who this baby really was, and why Don Ramon had wanted to destroy it so badly. As Clara sat by the fire, her thoughts raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something much deeper was at play here. The baby in the corner, so small and innocent, had been thrust into a world of violence and hatred because of things that neither of them could control. But there was still one question that haunted her, one that she couldn't get out of her mind. Who was the child really? She gently rocked the baby in her arms, the soft sounds of the night outside barely reaching her. She had to hold herself together, for the baby's sake. But her mind kept flashing back to the moment of birth, the strange, inexplicable moment when Estrella had given birth to a human child. It wasn't just a freak accident. There was something more. She looked up at Carlos, who had been quietly watching her for several minutes. His expression was unreadable, but Clara could tell he was waiting for her to ask the question that had been building up between them. "I need to know," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to this baby? Why was it hidden? And why did Don Ramon want it so badly?" Carlos shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn. "There's something you don't know, Clara," he began, his voice tense. "Something that none of us knew until recently. The baby is yours, your son." Clara's heart stopped. She looked at Carlos, her eyes wide in disbelief. "What are you talking about, my son? That's impossible. My son, he died years ago. I watched him." Carlos interrupted her, his expression dark. "He was taken from you. Don Ramon was the one who had him taken. He had plans to use the child for his own purposes, and he made sure everyone believed your son was dead. But he wasn't. He's been alive this whole time." Clara felt like the room was spinning. Her thoughts were in turmoil as the truth settled over her. She had never imagined that the baby she had found was her own flesh and blood. She had thought it was some kind of curse, something unnatural. But now it made sense. Don Ramon had taken her son, hidden him, and used him as a pawn in whatever twisted scheme he had devised. Her hands trembled as she cradled the baby in her arms, her tears beginning to fall freely. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All these years of pain and loss, all the memories of her son, had led her to this moment, a moment where everything had changed. The baby in her arms wasn't just some strange child. It was her own son, Emilio, the one she had lost so many years ago. Carlos watched her with quiet sympathy. "I know it's a lot to take in, Clara, but now you have the chance to make it right. Don Ramon is the one who needs to answer for what he did to you, and to your son." Clara wiped her tears away, her determination hardening. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain now. She wasn't going to let Don Ramon get away with this. He had taken everything from her. But now she had her son back, and she was going to fight to protect him, no matter what it cost. As Clara walked through the quiet village, she could feel the weight of the past few days pressing heavily on her chest. The truth about Emilio had shaken her to the core, but it also gave her a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting for something far more important than her own survival. She was fighting for her son. for the life that had been stolen from her, and for the justice that had been denied. The village that had once seemed so small and comforting now felt like a prison. The people who had once been her neighbors, her friends, now looked at her with suspicion, fear, and sometimes outright hatred. It was as if the entire world had turned against her, and she was left alone, carrying the burden of something so much bigger than herself. Don Ramon's power had seeped into every corner of the village, and his influence stretched far beyond what Clara had ever imagined. She had spent so many years in the comfort of the farm, never realizing how deep the roots of corruption ran. But now she knew the truth. She knew the monster that Don Ramon was, and she knew she had to stop him before it was too late. The wind howled through the trees as Clara made her way to the village square, where she had arranged to meet Carlos and the others. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she approached the gathering. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, but she couldn't back down now. The stakes were too high. Carlos was the first to notice her. He gave her a small nod as she approached, and for a brief moment, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. "Clara," he said softly. "We're ready." She took a deep breath and nodded. This was it. The moment she had been dreading and hoping for all at once. She had no more time to waste. She was going to confront Don Ramon, and she was going to make sure that he couldn't hurt anyone else again. Not her, not Emilio, not anyone. The plan was simple, at least in theory. They would confront Don Ramon, expose his lies, and bring him to justice. But Clara knew that nothing was ever that simple. There would be risks, there would be danger, and there would be people who would try to stop them. Don Ramon had far too many allies for things to go smoothly. But Clara didn't care. She had already lost too much to let fear control her now. With a deep breath, Clara stepped forward, flanked by Carlos and the others. The square felt like it had grown colder, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara could see the eyes of the villagers on her, watching her every move, judging her. But she held her head high. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled from her home. She was a mother, and she had a child to protect. As she approached the center of the square, Clara spotted Don Ramon. He was standing with his usual entourage, a smug smile on his face as if he already knew the outcome of this encounter. But Clara wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. "Don Ramon?" Clara called out, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "It's over. You've done enough damage." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Don Ramon's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a sneer. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing, Clara, you always were." But Clara wasn't intimidated. "You don't scare me anymore," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I know what you've done, and I'm going to make sure you pay for it." There was a long pause, the tension thick in the air. Clara could feel the eyes of the villagers on her, waiting for what would happen next. Don Ramon was a powerful man, but so was she now. She had the truth on her side, and she had the courage to fight for it. As the words hung in the air, a heavy silence descended on the square. The villagers exchanged uncertain glances, some of them still loyal to Don Ramon, others looking conflicted. The powerful man's grip on their hearts was slipping, and Clara could feel it. This wasn't just about confronting Don Ramon. It was about shattering the illusion of his power, about showing everyone that he wasn't invincible. For a moment, Don Ramon said nothing. His expression twisted from smug confidence to a cold fury that made Clara's skin prickle. He stepped forward, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The tension was unbearable, but Clara stood firm. Her mind raced, but her body was calm. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. "You're making a grave mistake, Clara," Don Ramon growled. "Do you think they'll believe your lies? Do you think they'll believe you over me?" But Clara didn't flinch. "I don't need them to believe me," she said, her voice steady. "I need them to believe in the truth. And the truth is, Emilio is my son, and you're the one who took him from me." At those words, the air shifted. It was as if a collective gasp swept through the crowd. The truth, the secret that Don Ramon had so desperately tried to bury, was out in the open. Clara saw the realization dawning on some faces, the shock, the disbelief, but also the glimmer of something else. Could they have been wrong? Could they have been manipulated all this time? Don Ramon's face twisted in rage, but he knew he had lost control. The truth had a power that no amount of lies could suppress. Clara had spoken with a conviction that even he couldn't deny, and for the first time, she saw cracks in his armor. "You're a fool, Clara," he spat, his voice venomous. "You think you can expose me? I have more power than you'll ever understand." But Clara wasn't intimidated. She wasn't afraid anymore. The people were watching, and they were starting to see the man for what he really was: a tyrant, a liar, a criminal. She had no time for his threats. "Your power doesn't matter anymore," Clara said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Because I'm not afraid of you anymore. You've hurt enough people, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." As the words left her lips, a murmur spread through the crowd. People began to shift, slowly stepping away from Don Ramon's side. Clara could see it happening. The grip he once had over them was slipping, bit by bit. Carlos, standing beside Clara, took a step forward, holding up a piece of evidence that had been carefully collected: the letter from the veterinarian confirming the truth about Emilio's identity. It was the final nail in Don Ramon's coffin. "Enough!" Don Ramon shouted, his face red with rage. "You don't know what you're doing. You're making a mistake you'll regret." But Clara wasn't listening. She had no more room for fear, for regrets, for what-ifs. She had already paid the price for this truth, and now she was ready for justice to take its course. With the support of the villagers who had finally found their courage, Don Ramon was arrested and taken away. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the man who had controlled their lives for so long was led out of the village, his arrogance shattered, his power dissolved. In the aftermath, Clara felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. It was over. Don Ramon would no longer haunt her, and more importantly, he would never hurt anyone again. The village, too, was changing. Clara saw the looks in the villagers' eyes, some of shame, some of gratitude. But all of them were now free from the darkness that had overshadowed them for so long. Clara turned to Emilio, her son, who had been with her throughout this entire journey. His small hand clutched hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt the warmth of hope blooming inside her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least it was a road she could walk on with Emilio by her side. As Clara looked around, seeing the village that had once been a place of fear now slowly returning to normal, she couldn't help but smile. Justice had been served, and her son was finally safe. And that, she realized, was the only thing that truly mattered.